So I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who I feel very comfortable in presenting as a carbon trader or a consultant, and we've got an agronomist over here as well. Over to you.
Thanks, Gary.
Still got the people online.
Yeah, perfect. I find that really interesting, and hence my questions. I learned a lot from you guys, so thank you. And the kind of way I'm seeing the difference, if I've understood correctly, if you're an arable farmer, happy to see that arable land change in its land use, including to sort of livestock management or something, then BNG is certainly something interesting to look at. Just to locate you for what I'm going to talk about, if you're an arable farmer looking to keep some or all of your land in arable production, and you're looking at, improving natural capital and how you can get paid for that, then this is kind of how that fits in, if I've understood correctly. So
then, there may be an overlap. I don't know. We'll see if we go.
Well, if you look at it from a scientific point of view, what you just heard about is obviously going to result in more carbon being stored in soil environments. So from a climate point of view, there's a strong overlap. Yeah. But in terms of what we're being paid for in the markets, I think we should see them, they're sitting side by side. Okay. Yeah. My ambition in our session is to help cut through the mist on this topic of carbon payments, because every agricultural show, every phone call we have with farmers day in, day out, actually is just reminding us that a lot of this marketplace, this carbon marketplace, is poorly understood. So I'm going to try and explain more about it today. I've got my colleague Lyndon in the room, who is an agronomist. My name's Andrew, and I lead our impact and carbon work at Soil Capital. And I'll introduce us in just a second to give you a tiny bit more context. But here's what I'm hoping to cover in our session, and I'd like it to be interactive throughout. So any help you can give me to spot questions online would be great. But equally, if something's not making sense or you want to challenge or debate, let's just jump in, because otherwise it's not valuable for you. But I want to give some location, first of all, to who are we and our view on carbon. I then want to spend a tiny bit of time just giving the overview of how carbon markets work. And then I want to finish with a slightly longer section on some big, frequently asked questions, some myth busting, frankly, as well, around how carbon markets interact with you as landowners or managers. And I promise we can count better than that. It's interactive, is it? Yeah, it is. Okay, snazzy. Just before I start then, by show of hands, is anyone already in a carbon trading or carbon payment scheme? No?
No hands up online.
Okay.
No.
And, I've sort of set out what I'm hoping to cover. Is anyone brave enough to sort of say, if there's one thing I can take from a session like this on carbon, it's this? Any sort of, you'll travel to spend time here either learning about BNG or carbon or both. So why have you done that?
And Andrew, I think the big question I have is that over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of excitement in selling carbon before BNG came in. A lot of excitement in selling carbon, and now we're told don't sell anything. Keep it on your farm because you
might need it.
Because you might need it on the farm. And then a meeting I had with Roy Thorne's lawyers a few months ago, saying you've got to be really, really careful because you've got people that can steal your carbon. And I'm not, I can't name the people who could steal your carbon, but if you sell a lorry load of wheat in that agreement, is carbon going down or up the food chain, and they've got some of your carbon. So these are the things that are the concerns, I think.
Sure. Chris, it looked like you were.
Well, this permanence thing has always been on my mind with carbon. It's like a fuel tank, your soil, and if it's got nothing in it, then you can be paid for adding to it, but it's finite, and then that's it. And is that the right way of thinking of it, or is it actually that it's difficult to achieve that permanence and it could come back to bite you? So that's the bit I don't really understand.
Yeah.
About this.
Okay.
Yeah.
And linked to that, are you selling per annum or are you selling permanently? Is the question I get asked quite often, which I don't know the answer to, because I think it varies depending who you're talking to.
Okay. Any other steers for how I, speed up or slow down on certain bits?
Have they actually worked out a way of calculating what carbon you're storing?
Right.
They keep pushing trees, but are they just a shock absorber to then release it in 100 years' time? Minute Batters on the radio I heard the other day came out with, well, actually grassland sequesters more carbon than a forest, which is something that I think we've been sort of mulling over for ages, and nobody seems to give, there's no definite answer.
Yeah. So
how can you work out a numerical value to something that doesn't really have a calculation at the moment?
Great, thank you. Is that quite a comment or question popping up?
Yeah, update on the soil carbon code, please.
Okay.
Who's that from?
Charlie.
Charlie. Thanks, Charlie.
All right, so permanence, quantification, the code, and selling mining rights and having it stolen from under your feet and so on. Okay. So just to introduce Soil Capital first of all, as Gary said, we're actually a 10-year-old agronomy firm. That's headquarters in Belgium. So working in farm barns, I'm not going to do that a lot.
Yeah.
Grain silo in there. That's one of our co-founders' house, and the office is on the end. So our background is rooted in farming in rural communities. I say that because we work alongside plenty of entities in Europe now that are sort of tech companies trying to, help grow carbon farming markets and so on. That's not our background. In fact, we were founded 10 years ago by two individuals, with one who is the farmer and agronomist on the left, Nicholas, and one who has a business and finance background. And actually what brought them together was a shared vision that farming, in a way to improve soil health, should also be a farming set of practices that improves profitability. And if we can actually prove that out and make it accessible by very many farmers, then that's actually pretty good news. And so our mission has always been to prove that out and ultimately enable 1 million hectares of farmland to be transitioned to more profitable and regenerative agriculture by 2025. And we've built now a multidisciplinary team of 30 to do that, but still right at our core, 50% of us are agronomists by background and training, or from family farms and so on. So we're very much rooted in that background. Before we started focusing on carbon payments 3 and a bit years ago, we worked as a straightforward independent agronomy company, boots on the ground, actually all around the world, not just in Europe, helping farms, arable livestock, fruit production transition to regenerative systems with enhanced profitability. So that we come from the sort of boots on the ground background. And with that in mind, we always find it extremely important to say at the beginning of a conversation like this, yes, we're going to go on and talk about carbon payments. But even without payments, carbon in the soil is good for farmers. And hopefully, this is increasingly not a sort of debatable subject where, we lock horns on this. But, a couple of basic facts. Every 1% uplift in soil organic matter on a hectare of land enables that hectare of land to store about 200,000 litres more water.
You just released a lot of carbon in that hole.
Not a huge amount. I only did that once to quote. But actually, what's fascinating there is that we're looking at the wormholes that are travelling up the roots and actually bringing that to life for not just farmers but companies that are involved in sourcing from these farmers. So, water, drought and flood management, increasingly important topic at the moment. Same statistic, 1% increase in soil organic matter per hectare delivers between 2,000 and 4,000 kilograms of nitrogen, natural fertility, which is what's a unit of nitrogen at the moment here, UK cost. Who's going to venture of product? Yeah. So, well, on the continent, when we talk about this, it's that's sort of 8,000 to 10,000 euros per hectare of avoided nitrogen cost. We're also talking about healthy. Carbon in the soil is a more biologically active soil, and we are starting to understand more and more that means more natural plant resistance to disease, agrochemical impact. So, and I can go on. There are plenty of reasons that carbon in the soil is a strategic thing for landowners and farmers to pursue, even before we start talking about patients. And that's our agronomy talking. But of course, when we are talking about improving the greenhouse gas balance of farming, first of all, it's important for me to say that we're not just talking about soil carbon here. We're also talking about the ways in which farming practices produce greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Tailpipe of the tractor, the production of fertilizer that we use, and so on. And so you've got emissions going into the atmosphere. You've also got management practices that increase how carbon is stored in the soil. You net those off each other, and you get a balance for your farm operation. And so the 5 sort of practices that are going to have the biggest impact on keeping that land in arable production, but reducing the greenhouse gas balance, are these. Replacing synthetic inputs, fertilizer, agrochemicals with organic. Maximising soil coverage with living plants. Every time a plant is photosynthesizing, it's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting some carbon into the soil in the form of carbohydrates. Diversifying the rotation, legumes in the rotation are obviously going to have a direct impact on our ability to reduce synthetic nitrogen, for example. Minimizing soil disturbance, full inversion ploughing is going to expose the carbon that is in the soil to oxygen in the air, C plus O2, CO2. And integrating agroforestry inside field boundaries. This is a more innovative niche practice today, but you see farmers doing sort of alley cropping of fruit or nuts trees the same width of their largest machine, so they can continue to grow arable crops while also introducing lines of trees that have a different revenue profile and introduce biodiversity into the system as well. So these are the sort of practices that we're talking about. So that's a little bit about who we are as Soil Capital, agronomy firm, not here originally to monetize carbon, but actually finding that is a very powerful way to do what we have done as an agronomy firm, one-to-one advice, to then bring a new revenue incentive to many, many, many more farmers than we could ever touch as a smaller agronomy business. So let me dig in now a little bit to how carbon markets work, because I know that this is not a familiar marketplace. It's not something we've all looked at for years and years. And there are some important foundations that we need to understand. And the first one is that carbon is not traded in one single market. And this picture on the left is going to help to illustrate this, because you've got some farmland in the foreground and you've got heavy industry, power production and so on the horizon. So the carbon market, to simplify things, is broken down into two major categories. The first one being the regulated market. So if you are in a certain sector in the UK, energy intensives, power generation, and aviation, government will set a limit on how much pollution you can emit, and government will create a market for you to trade allowances with others if you're a bit over and they're a bit under. So in some way, it might be the role government's playing in the VNG market is telling companies what they must do, is creating the structure for a marketplace. But in carbon terms, that only applies to certain heavy emitting sectors. And then everything that's outside of that is the so-called voluntary market. So all other sectors, including food and farming. It's not true to say that these sectors have no standards. There are plenty of international standards from entities called Vera Gold Standard and ISO, the International Standards Organization. The question actually is whether providers like us choose to use them. So that's your first sort of piece of advice. You know, it's not obligatory to use one of these standards in the voluntary market, but they exist. So if you're looking at an offer, you should understand what standard they're using. Within this voluntary sector, there's a really, really important sub-distinction to make. Because within the voluntary sector, you basically have two different types of activity happening. Offsetting, which we're slightly more familiar with as a word, and insetting, which we're less familiar with as a word. Now, offsetting is basically the VNG market that we heard about today, in the sense that what we heard about mainly was biodiversity negative impacts happening over here from the development, and biodiversity positive impacts happening over here, somewhere completely separate in the local area, with a transaction. And that's carbon offsetting. You know, you take a flight, you're offered the chance to purchase some carbon credits to offset your carbon emissions. And what's happening there is EasyJet or whatever is paying people or businesses that it has no other commercial relationship with to do something good for the climate over there. They get a credit for paying that company or project or person for doing that, and they get to claim carbon neutrality as a result. So it's called offsetting because there's no other commercial relationship between EasyJet and, let's say, the farmer.
So is that what we call greenwashing?
Big debate. Offsetting has a role. It can be done well, it can be done badly. Increasingly, the mood, let's say, in the markets is that offsetting is kind of the option of last resort in carbon terms. You should be doing everything possible to reduce your own emissions.
It is as bad as you like,
Yeah.
but you're offsetting it, and that's greenwashing.
Yeah. And plenty of farmers we speak to in the UK, on the continent, are nervous about this because in French they talk about the droit à polluer, the right to pollute. They don't like the idea of giving EasyJet a free pass. That is distinct, though, from insetting. Insetting, to explain, I started to use a topical metaphor of Russian dolls. So when we think about a farmer growing barley, selling the barley to a maltster, produces malt, who sells the malt to a brewer, who produces the beer, who sells the beer, let's say, directly to us. Keep things simple. When we're looking at the carbon footprint of the brewer, the big doll, the brewer's carbon footprint includes today the footprint of the maltster, the middle doll, and all the farmers producing the barley, the little dolls. Because today, companies have to take into account the carbon footprint of their supply chain. Okay, so before any of us start doing anything to reduce the carbon footprint of farming, already you need to know that your footprint of your farm is actually accounted for many times on the balance sheet, the carbon balance sheet of the people that buy the company that buy your crops, that process them, and ultimately sell them on. So before we even start, there's this net of Russian dolls, which exists for legitimate reasons.
They're not they're not taking your credits, so they're just.
I'm just describing how the carbon accounting world works before we start trading.
There's no trading in this. This is just purely.
Well, what I'm going to come on to explain is in insetting.
Sorry. Okay.
Let's say basically companies now have a very strong incentive before they go and offset to a company that they have no relationship with to actually do what they can to reduce their own emissions, including their supply chain emissions. And it's called insetting because there is an existing commercial relationship between the farmers, the maltsters, and the brewers. So insetting is carbon trading within the crop supply chain, keeping the crop and the carbon together. And I'm going to come back to that distinction later because it has a direct impact on how worried should I be about future commitments and so on. So just remember there's the Russian doll thing.
Don't mention the Russians.
I think there's a difference between Russian heritage and the current political.
Yes.
That's my line and I'm saying that. Okay, so another kind of important basic fact is what do carbon markets pay for? Carbon markets have existed globally for 20 or 30 years. And originally, they came into being to enable companies to find ways for other people around the world to reduce their emissions. And I'm emphasizing that point because what we're seeing here is a lady, probably in Africa, with a so-called clean cook stove. She's still producing carbon emissions by burning wood in a cleaner way. She's still emitting. She's still part of the problem from a climate point of view. But yesterday, before she started getting carbon payments from the carbon markets, she was doing it in an even worse way. And carbon markets came into existence to find the most economically efficient, brackets, cheapest way to reduce emissions anywhere in the world. Because a ton of carbon dioxide from Malawi is going to have the same impact on the atmosphere as a ton of carbon dioxide from Bedfordshire. So carbon markets have existed to begin with to find the best way to reduce emissions anywhere in the world, even if the people being paid are still emitting. And then more recently, of course, what was added to that was various ways to also pay people to take carbon out of the atmosphere, to go a step further. And the most obvious example is planting trees. That's what carbon markets have done for a long time. And it's only in the last 5 to 10 years that we've started to wake up to the fact that we might be able to farm in a way that keeps land in production and increase sequestration of carbon in the soil. So we can play a part in this as well as this. And I'm saying all of this because sometimes people say, don't I need to be already net zero before I can get paid for carbon? And the answer is technically from the market, absolutely not. The market is set up to both incentivize emission reduction and carbon storage. Morally, you might have a different view. Totally fine, it's your choice. But technically, from the market's point of view, there isn't that hard requirement. The next two slides are just a little bit of taxonomy, really. I know that this marketplace can be quite confusing. And so I'm just going to give a few words and a few steers to sort of how to think about what these different entities do. So who are the key actors in the carbon markets? Well, obviously, to start with, there are you, farmers, and people that bring farmers together into groups that make it easier to engage with the carbon markets, aggregators like us. Now, that's where it starts. Then you're going to get people that set standards, and I mentioned some of those earlier, FIRA, gold standard ISO, but also the question from online about the soil carbon code in the UK. So there's a a consortium of entities outside of government that's trying to create a UK-based rule book for how to do this stuff. And then you're going to have a bunch of ways to quantify emission reduction and carbon sequestration. I've called them calculators here, but they might be, soil labs and technology companies that do clever soil analysis, through to people that develop models that do the same thing from a modeling point of view. In our case, just to kind of give examples, we're using today this ISO standard 14064, and we're using a model combined with some soil analysis called the Cool Farm tool, which some of you may have heard of or even used. I'm happy to sort of go deeper into the quantification.
So Andrew, we hear there are about 70 different sort of CFTs around. Is that right?
Globally, you mean? Or?
No, well, in England, that's what I've heard.
Well,
in the UK, there are 70 different cool farm people, around 70 different organisations or companies or ways of measuring.
Yeah, this is kind of why I'm giving this taxonomy, actually, because there may be 70 different entities doing something in the carbon markets in the UK.
Right.
There are 2 or 3 major calculators that are used today in the UK.
That's right, 70 calculators, I thought. Well, I've heard.
I don't recognise that number.
Different calculator.
Sorry?
Different calculator. Different value.
Yeah.
So have the standards not been finalised yet? It still seems very early days that they're debating these standards.
So what you have at the moment is some international standards, the ones I've been mentioning, Vera, Gold Standard, and ISO. And you have a movement in the UK that says, well, we should do our own national thing. We're today using an international standard in the UK, France, and Belgium. We're very actively involved in that UK focused effort on the code. I was on a 2-hour call with them this morning. But the premise is these international standards that already exist aren't quite adapted to the UK enough. We should do our own thing. There's some merit in that, but then when you talk to, I'll come on to talk about the big buyers that we work with, the food buyers, the crop buyers. They're sourcing from countries all around the world, and for them it's a nightmare to imagine every country having its own.
I was thinking about BSI and CNISO all interplaying, yet we're trying to do it on a global basis of carbon, aren't we? So.
Yeah, so there's this mosaic emerging for some good reasons, but it's also creating some complexity. So like I was saying earlier, it's not right to say there are no standards today. Then you're going to have some bodies that come in and audit everything. We heard earlier about the local authorities doing that for BNG. There's going to be a similar role played in carbon, some outside entities that check, basically. And some registries, a bit like a sort of public library, I suppose, that list, you were talking about the blockchain sort of solution to make it visible to everybody who has bought what, so you can't double sell. Same thing exists in the carbon world, where you have public and third-party registries that list the carbon units that have been generated and sold so that people can see that there's no double selling happening. Again, just to give you some examples of names, we use a German auditor called TÜV Rheinland and a registry called the CSA Group, which is another entity. And then lastly, you're going to have some brokers who are really focused on selling the units. In our case, we partner with a global carbon markets business called South Pole to do that. And buyers. And because in our case, we're focused as a business on the insetting market, not the offsetting market, our buyers are buyers of crops like Cargill, like AB InBev, like L'Oreal. Big component of cosmetics is the alcohol from sugar beet. And then lastly in this section, what does the market require? One of your words, Chris, is on this slide, but again, just to give you some orientation on words and concepts that are often talked about. Scientific credibility is one. I don't know if there are 70 calculators in the UK, but the 3 or 4 that exist in the UK are pretty much all based on international climate science. And they present that in different sort of front ends, which is the basis of the credibility. In different ways, the market requires this concept of additionality. How do we know that what we're paying for wouldn't have happened otherwise? Permanence is the third. How do we know that the carbon that goes into the soil will stay there for an acceptable amount of time? And how do we know that everything that Soil Capital is telling us is true? Can we come along and verify it for ourselves? Is there a system of independent checking? I will touch on many of these points in the third and final section, but at the same time, a shortcut in addressing all of these is to say every scheme that you have heard of or could talk to should have a rulebook, protocol. You should be able to see it. In our case, this is 100 pages long, so we don't ask you to read this. We ask you to read a summarized version. But there should be a protocol. And this, one of the first steps we had to go through 3 years ago was to have this 100-page document reviewed by an auditor against the ISO standards and confirmed or denied whether we aligned with it. So now on to the final bit, these kind of FAQs, and this is really where we'll look at many of the myths, and I'll try and dig into some of the questions that were asked at the beginning as well. Before I do that, just to give context to where these answers are coming from, we're not, we brought Europe's first certified carbon payment program to market in 2020. We now have more than 500 farmers, more than 100,000 hectares in 3 countries in the program. We paid the first 100 farmers €1 million in June this year, an average of €10,000 each. The point is, we're talking here from some experience being in this market rather than projecting about what we think could or should happen. It is, just like the biodiversity world, a nascent, evolving marketplace. You'll hear me repeat that and talk with humility that we have our own improvements to do all over the shop, no doubt. But at the same time, we are talking from some reasonable, experience here. One of the early frequently asked questions is the kind of basics of how this works. And at its simplest level, it is simple. Farmers, through their management practices, through their ongoing farming activities, either reduce their emissions or increase the carbon they store in the soil, or both, by changing how they farm. We assist in giving data and analytics about where those changes might happen, but our main role is also to come in and quantify that change with a combination of soil analysis and the model that we use, and through our audited process, turn those improvements into carbon certificates in our case, because we're in the inset market, using that ISO standard, with each certificate being equivalent to a ton of carbon dioxide or the other greenhouse gases that are involved in a farming system. Companies come along, in our case, supply chain companies in the main, to purchase those carbon certificates, and that generates a revenue which flows back to the farmers. Gary, we didn't prime your question. Is it annual, or am I sort of selling away the rights?
Yeah.
It comes up all the time. And so I'm going to tackle it as one of my first FAQs. And I quite like an analogy, especially when stuff is a bit complicated. And here's my analogy here, with a very bad clip art of a bathtub. What am I talking about? Okay, the bath represents your soil. The water that's in the bath before we turn on the tap represents the carbon that is already in your soil, the stock. Then you turn on the tap and you start adding carbon to the soil. A flow. Okay, so we've now got a shared understanding of a stock and a flow. To the best of my knowledge, there are no carbon markets in the world paying farmers for the stock, for access to the stock, to claim offset rights based on the stock, or anything like it. They are all focused on the flow on an annual basis that you add to the soil each year. So to your point earlier, Gary, your question, yes, it's annual monitoring and it's annual payments because it's specifically looking to reward the annual flow of carbon into the soil, not the stock.
Just to take that stage further,
Yeah.
So if I do a deal with whoever, I can do a deal with you for 1 year, but I can do a deal with whoever, other traders, and lock in for 5 years or 10 years. And that's the concern I have.
So we're going to come on to kind of the idea of lock-in and
Which is a
question on permanence.
Yes, which
It still matters
exactly.
that the stuff you add to the soil each year stays there.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
So we'll come on to that. But
Yeah.
but this starting
It's a legal question mainly, isn't it? So am I selling all my carbon into the next 5 years, etc.?
Right, and I think part of that question comes from this belief that maybe I'm trading away my stock of carbon rather than the flow.
Is there a maximum amount of carbon you can have? Like, so does your bathtub get full?
Yes.
And you can't put any more in it?
You're using the analogy in exactly the way I hoped. The kind of consensus position from a scientific point of view, and obviously there's always kind of people that disagree with consensus, and that's healthy, but the consensus position is that once you filled your bath, you can't get any more water in. So put that another way, most arable farmland soils are depleted of carbon relative to where they started. We can change things to increase that, but there will be a new equilibrium, a new saturation point, after which you won't be adding more carbon to the soil.
Got a question from the chat as well.
Yeah.
Are farmers who are already carbon negative disadvantaged in the fact that there is less extra good they can achieve?
I'll come to that.
Who's that?
David.
Yeah, thanks, David. I've got a slide on that in just a few moments. Another basic question will be from some, are certain types of farms excluded? And so here's just an example of our kind of eligibility criteria. In our case, we're operating in 3 countries. If you're out of those 3 countries, we're not there today. In our case, we're focused on arable farming systems with a small amount of livestock integration. But if you're a mixed farm or a livestock entity, we haven't yet developed to get to that point. So that's something to watch out for in terms of, I need to put sellotape on my hand or something. That's something to watch out for.
State of the art, this is.
Yeah, very good. When you're looking at different schemes, do they have kind of fundamental farming system rules? And there's no problem with being conventional or organic. We have a healthy mix in our program, but again, that's something to look at. These are kind of big questions to ask early on. And then, a little bit like the VNG process, actually, there's a process to go through, and this is going to be similar for different schemes that are available. Not necessarily the details, but the basic building blocks. So when you join the scheme, the first thing that will happen is a carbon assessment of your historical farming practices. Why? To establish a baseline. Where are you starting from? And in our case, the result of that is to put you into one of 2 categories. Those categories being on a whole farm, whole arable system basis, you are net emitting carbon, which is true for the vast majority. Or you might be in the minority where you've already made practice changes and you are on a net basis, you're still emitting some greenhouse gases, but actually overall you're storing far more in your soils, and so on a net basis you're sequestering, you're storing. And I'll come back to that distinction in just a second in terms of how you generate revenue. But then you're going to go through a period of time called the crediting period. In our case, that's 5 years, where what you do in terms of your management practices is monitored each year, and the changes that you make to your carbon footprint generates carbon certificates. So that's the kind of active period where you're making changes and you're earning certificates.
Is that generating income in that period?
Okay, I'm just about to say that. So at the end of each of those years, 80% of those carbon certificates can be sold immediately and you're paid immediately. 20% are held back in an insurance mechanism. It's called a buffer. And they're held there for 10 years, which is our period of permanence. Why does this have to happen? Because the buyers need to know, as I said earlier, that there is some security that the carbon that's been put into the soil will stay there for a reasonable amount of time. And in our case, for now, that is 10 years. We monitor using satellite imagery farms for that 10-year period, because mainly the trigger for release of carbon from the soil, as I said earlier, is more intensive ploughing, which is relatively easy to observe unobtrusively from space. At the end of that 10-year period, the buffer certificates can be released and sold as normal. And so there's a positive financial incentive for the farmer at the end of that to align their interests financially with the interests of the market on permanence. Different schemes will have different ways of managing that permanence requirement. That's ours. It's something you should look at carefully, because there may be clawback clauses, for example. If you do something in year 12, you may owe us money back, or some other mechanism. So that's a question you should ask regularly. It's an important one. And so this was the question from the chat. Was it David, you said? Yeah. If I already store carbon, am I disadvantaged? In many schemes, yes. And the way the UK Soil Carbon Code looks to be developing, you may be disadvantaged as well on this point. But in our scheme today, we've worked really hard to make sure that in our scheme today, the answer is no. Why? Because we come from a farming background and we understand very well that there are going to be early adopters that will be very important sources of learning for other farmers, and they need to be part of this market too. So this is how it works in terms of generating certificates. In our scheme, depending on whether you start life as an emitter or a sequestering farm. If you're an emitter, what you're seeing here in the yellow line is tons of CO2 per hectare, and it's the positive number, meaning emissions. Okay, if this was under the line here, a negative number, it would mean that on a net basis, you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it in the soil. So here is your baseline as a net emitter. If you're in this situation, we fix your baseline for the 5-year crediting period, and any improvement you make against that, even before you get to net zero, as I described earlier, is going to generate carbon certificates, which can be sold as we described earlier. Okay, that's simple. That basically means if you start life as a net emitter, you have to adopt practices that are going to improve that based on your own footprint. If you're net storing when you start, that would create a reverse incentive. Because you would say, I haven't got additional practices to adopt nearly so much, but I also have an opportunity each year to rip up my land, and I'm quite tempted to do that for other reasons. Wry smile, because we know it's true. And I'll just go back and position myself as one of these guys and go back down this journey, because I've de-risked it for myself. I know how to do this, whereas others maybe don't. That's madness. And so what we have in our scheme today is that we use a regional baseline for net sequestering farms. We analyse common practice in a region using independent agronomists. We take a very conservative view of what that looks like. So this is not saying that's what everybody emits in a region. It's a derivative of that. But we basically create a slightly emitting baseline, and any improvement against that regional baseline for the net sequestering farms generates carbon certificates. And so in this model, these farmers have an incentive both to maintain their good practices, as long as they're still filling up the bathtub. Let's go back to that point. You fill up the bathtub, different story. But also, of course, improving, there's an incentive to improve as well. A lot of hype around the carbon markets, lots of chat about future prices, 100 tonnes this, 200 tonnes that, £200 per tonne that. Should I wait for higher prices in the future is therefore often a question. And the answer is not necessarily. If you're close to filling up your bath, once you've filled it, there's not going to be anything additional that you can add to the bath, and therefore the carbon markets aren't going to reward you. So if you're going to wait it out for 10 years or more while continuing to make practice change, the bath's going to fill up, and at some point you'll run out of runway. So
Can you not, using your bath analogy again, obviously you said you retain 20% every year to ensure that carbon's stored until year 15. Can you not fill your bathtub up in year 1? That's obviously registered, and then choose to sell those credits at a later, sell them at a later date.
Well, so the buffer certificates are sold at a later date, and so and they're sold at the future price. So that bit of your question, I think, holds. The other part of your question is, can you generate the certificates and sit on them? In certain schemes, you can. In ours, not. And the reason, there are two reasons. One is we're trying to build a market here, and we don't have the regulatory driver that's pushing developers to us. We're working with companies to build this market. And so having the dynamic where there's a bunch of certificates that are being created but aren't going to be taken to market really doesn't help anyone. The other reality is that these certificates have a shelf life. So sitting on them for many, many years may not be in the best interests of the farmer. So I've summarised there about the bathtub piece. And then, of course, each scheme should be able to tell you, all right, you persuaded me, I should be in this game now, but prices are going to go up and down all the time over the next 5 years. How do I benefit from that? And so every scheme should be able to look you in the eye and say, this is how it works. This is how it works in our case. Applicable work. So as we established earlier, we sell carbon certificates annually. Means we can go back and reprice, retap the market each year. And our commitment to our farmers is that you will always get 70% of the final sales price, whatever that price is. Okay, so you as if and when market prices rise, you ride that wave too. The other 30% is split between our audit costs, our sales partners' costs, South Pole, and a small commission to us. Another example of our accounting being off here, 0.111. But the final point on this is that we also self-impose a floor price. It is a free market, but we say to growers that we will not sell your certificates unless we can pay you £23 per tonne per certificate at this point. For context, in euros, that commitment was 27.50. So the first 100 farmers that I talked about earlier that came in 2021, they got a commitment of 27.50 per tonne. When they were paid in June, they were paid €32 per tonne. Because the market was healthy. Okay, I'm coming back to my Russian dolls now. Pleased to know if you've got a good analogy, use it twice. Will I be stuck meeting supply chain net zero demands? So a lot of people say to us, I'm advised now by lawyers, by land agents, by others, that I need to be really careful selling all my carbon. Yeah, it's from the bath, but selling the top bit of the bath, because maybe I'll need it in the future, because someone in the supply chain is going to say you have to be net zero if you want to do business with me. And this is where the distinction between insetting and offsetting makes a crucial difference. And this distinction was actually made clear by a report published at this year's Oxford Farming Conference in January, called Natural Capital, the Battle for Control, where they made exactly the same point which I'm about to make to you, which is the following. Because the brewer's carbon footprint already includes the maltster's and the farmer's carbon footprint, if the farmer improves their carbon footprint and sells that improvement to the brewer, it is totally logical for both parties to claim the reduction. Why is it totally logical? Because the carbon was double counted in the first place to make the point that all of the carbon interlinkages in the economy do overlap. And so actually, if you're in the insetting space, you're working towards the supply chain's net zero demand whenever it comes. And you're evidencing it, if you're with a credible scheme, with their audit system and so on. You're not just saying to the crop buyer, well, trust me, I've done X and Y. Conversely, if you're offsetting, imagine another family of Russian dolls over here for EasyJet. If you're offsetting, your carbon improvements are going to a different Russian doll family, and they can't be counted twice because there's no pre-existing double counting of the carbon in the first place. When this analogy is fully formed, there'll be two sets of Russian doll families, and maybe they'll be animated and moving around. We're working on that, but I hope that's making the point that basically what this report says is it depends how you sell your carbon, is the answer to that. If you're insetting, you're fine. If you're offsetting, you're not. And in our case, we're not involved in the offsetting space. Given that the state of the government schemes is currently very, very unclear, let's come back to that if you want to. I'm happy to talk about it, but it may be redundant in 24 hours. So let's move on. Sometimes, will this be an admin headache? No, we don't think so. In our situation, we've spent a lot of time, those of our team who are from farming and agronomy backgrounds sat down. We brought in tech developers to create a piece of software to enable you to encode your operational practices into the system we use. So it's designed with a farmer in mind. It's map-based, mostly just a mouse, not even a keyboard. And what we've experienced is it's less than 3 hours a year that farmers are spending encoding their data. So Lyndon is one of the agronomy team who sits opposite a farmer and is there basically for the last 1/3 of the process to do that together on a screen share. So it's actually not all on your own either. It's accompanied by an agronomy expert. And that's about it really. Finishing it.
Andrew, we've just got Tim. Got a hand up.
Hello, Tim.
Yeah, hi. Quick question. So if you take 1 hectare of land that is currently arably farmed and you create a BNG agreement on it and you have an ongoing maintenance agreement on that, as we've heard Sam talk about, you are effectively going to be filling the bath, to use your analogy. So why don't you at the same time engage yourselves and get a carbon assessment, and then that BNG agreement and maintenance agreement will combine the two?
Yeah, and I think Sam and Melissa referred to being interested in the future sort of carbon potential of the activities that you're involved with. From our point of view, Tim, there is a real sensitivity in the carbon markets that we engage with around food production. So actually, it's not possible in our scheme to change land use. Arable land needs to stay as operational arable land. If you take it out of arable production and put it into grassland or, scrub or whatever, then you're totally entitled to do that, but you'll find that you won't be able to enter into the carbon markets as they currently stand, because there is in the carbon markets today a big sensitivity in this conflict, perceived or otherwise, that by incentivizing carbon improvements will affect food production. And to the comment earlier, just import food from countries where they chop down trees to do that, and then the climate's no better off.
Okay, but that's a current position, potentially could change.
Well, yeah, and for example, that's the private sector market point of view. Who's to say, doesn't seem totally likely today, but there seems to be a lot of money that the government's able to access. Who's to say that the government won't pay for carbon on top of BNG activities because they know that the private sector can't or won't do that?
Okay, thank you.
Just to close, one of you may be brave enough to say, what does this look like financially?
Which is going to be my question.
Right. And the simple answer is it depends on your farm system. I talked earlier about 100 farms paid in their first year an average of €10,000 each. It doesn't compare at all to what we heard from the BNG team. But that's because we're talking about a completely different land use. We're talking about keeping arable land in arable production.
You've got the gross margin.
Yeah. We've built a simple free simulator to simulate your earnings, because it does depend on your practices, your soil type, etc. It takes about 10-15 minutes to work through. Someone like Lyndon could easily shave that down to 7 or 8 minutes with you on a phone call or something. Another example of bad numbering. Sorry about that. But this is how to answer the question of how much it could mean in your case, is to plug your info into the simulator. And we can, if you share your contact details today, we can easily give you access if you're interested to do that. That's it.
Good. Thank you very much. So,
did I fail to answer anybody? So I answered the permanence question, I think.
Chris,
I answered your annual question. Annual classification, I've got the nod of somewhat okay. The one on the line, still carbon code.
So, yeah, so
Maybe just one extra minute on that.
If you could, yeah, sure, because we hear a lot of that, and that's evolving, but it's not there, is it?
So the soil carbon code comes from a place of saying there are international standards, but there isn't a standard that's specific to the UK. Should we have one? We already have a woodland carbon code, a peatland carbon code, which some of you may be aware of, which are government-backed ways to generate carbon credits from peatland management and woodland management. The soil carbon code is not government-owned today. It's happening outside of government with some government funding via the Environment Agency. And it's not trying to come up with a prescriptive thou shalt do X, Y, and Z like the woodland carbon code. It's actually now trying to set minimum requirements for schemes like ours, which may involve us adapting what we do. But the idea is that they then give the kind of type mark, to use the BSI analogy, the sort of stamp of approval. They have been developing this and consulting fairly widely for the last 6 months, I would say. And I think their ambition is to come up with a final set of recommendations in the next month. But this is recommendations for someone like BSI to pick up and turn into official minimum requirements. So there will be a milestone in about a month, but it won't be, ta-da, here's a code. It will be, here, BSI, would you like to take this as a very healthy starting point to develop?
Okay, good. Is that Charlie, I think, asked that. You okay with that, Charlie? If you could hear him? Yes.
Silence.
He said, yeah, put thumbs up.
Yeah.
Okay, so, yeah, thank you. So, thank you, Charlie. So, yes, so, and obviously, the inevitable question for me is how you're taxed on the receipt. Do you know, or have we got any thoughts on this in the corner, in our tax team in the corner? We're particularly reading an article on it. Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. So there's a credit every year, or is it the same credit
Yes.
where you get income from each year?
Different certificates in our scheme, but credits in others, different credits or certificates each year issued with a value.
Standalone credits.
Exactly. Whereas I think in the BNG world, it was a credit that has a value for 30
Yeah, exactly. It's,
to cover a period of 30 years.
Yeah.
But it is a credit that is referring to what has happened in the previous year.
So I think that should mean you're more on a capital taxation because you've got one of something and it is being sold.
you're selling an asset.
Yeah.
You're selling a credit. So
Yeah, our understanding in France and Belgium, I don't know if it's different contexts, is that it might be seen more as an income,
okay.
just as an income stream and therefore
Right.
income. So,
There are arguments both ways.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So you're selling a bit of the turn that you fill each year. So once you've sold it, that's it, and you sell, and it carries, the flow carries on, and you sell the new amount of, yeah.
and the bath needs to stay at that level of
The bath must come down.
Yeah, exactly. For 10 years.
Yeah. It can never come down. You need to keep it going up and up until it's full.
But you can only sell it if it keeps going up, but you, if you don't improve it in 1 year, you just don't have anything to sell.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How many tons is it roughly a year on improvement? Looking at your graphs, it's like 1 ton, 1.5 tons of carbon improvement.
Yeah, those were just stylistic, but actually what I could have put up is the data from our first 100, and you'd see that the average improvement rate, or the average rate of certificate generation per hectare, is between 1 and 1.5 tons per hectare. An average, so there are some.
And does it become incremental?
Sorry?
Does it become incremental? Does it reduce each year the amount that you can sequester based on the system, or?
It depends how close you are to filling up the bath. Imagine an S-shaped curve. I'm talking here about how it sort of actually happens in the soil, and different models will represent this in different ways. But, if you've got a very empty bath, this is where the bath analogy breaks down, because the flow of the tap is the same, isn't it, the whole time, all the way through. But the bath will fill up, quickly, and then as it gets near the top, it will fill up more slowly.
Is your bath shaped like that?
Maybe that's how they fix the analogy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got a question from David, which I think you probably touched on.
David Knight. Hi, David.
So if all being assessed for potential income from carbon, would it be financially better off if I ploughed up some of my grassland and put it back out into the bush? Would I think it back to grass?
No, because in our scheme and in all other schemes that I know of, land use change, which includes arable to grassland and so on, isn't allowed.
Same for the NG.
If it's permanent pasture, not longer than 5 years, so temporary grassland, no problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what happens after there's 10 years?
Well, it depends why you're asking the question. You can choose to, after the end of your 5 years, enroll in another 5-year period where you would have a new baseline set, because you think you've got more improvements to make.
More filling.
More filling to do, exactly. In which case, at the end of your first 10-year period, the second 10-year period will still be on there.
Yeah.
Right? But let's just say it's more simple than that, and you've done your 5 years plus your 10. After that, the permanence period is over. So, in principle, no one's monitoring anymore. That's it.
Pull the plug out of the bath.
Pull the plug out of the bath. Why not? And the answer to why not is that by the time you've been doing it for 15 years, as a farmer, you will have seen plenty of other economic reasons to continue with the system that you have. And you'll look at the cost of ploughing alone. Every centimetre of ploughing is about a litre of fuel. It's about €5 on the continent. It'd be different here. But going back and ripping it all up has a material cost, which, quite apart from everything else, is something to consider.
I hoped you were going to say that.
Happy to oblige.
So why wouldn't a farmer do this? Everybody's moving to actually plus minimal tillage, etc. Many are already there. Minimal tillage as opposed to no tillage, which couldn't get room. But most people are already in min-till, aren't they? For economic reasons. So by adding water in the bar, why wouldn't you do it? In the bit before I heard you talk, I didn't know why you wouldn't, but I can't see why the reason.
Well, I mean, the reason I presented this in terms of FAQs is that what I see happening at the moment in the market, we, Lyndon and I, every day, we're talking to British farmers and about the British market, but we're also talking to French farmers, French market, Belgian market. There's a big difference between the type of conversation that happens in the UK on carbon and that happens in France. In France, they don't ask any of these questions about the sort of fear-mongering questions that have made them say, "Oh, I've been advised I shouldn't trade anything." And the reason they don't is that the government has set the standard on carbon payments. It's kind of normalised the whole idea and this whole ecosystem. Here we have a vacuum. Because the government hasn't done that. That's why this code is coming forward. And in that vacuum, lots of different points of view have been put out, some of which are perfectly legitimate, due diligence questions to ask and unanswered questions that we still don't know the answer to. And some are just plain wrong and misleading. Like, I wonder how much the bathtub thing will stick with you because you may have had in your mind that actually this is all about mining rights to mine all the carbon in my soil. It's just not how the market works. So the reasons why people would say no at the moment is that there's all these sort of preconceptions, myths, mixed in with perfectly legitimate reasons to be cautious.
Maybe the government needs to introduce a tax reduction for environmental income.
Could be. Ask.
In vogue, isn't it?
Now's the time.
Under a similar vein, so if, say, the France government have set a standard, have they also explicitly set the taxation treatment rather than it being
Unknown.
best guess of existing tax legislation?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Well, I know that in France, the common understanding is that it's income and income tax, but I don't know whether that's come from an official government position or revenue.
Could be a consensus. Yeah.
Because that would just be really interesting.
It would. I'll ask.
Thank you.
We worked with tax and accounting firms in France, so
To hear the logic from the French logic that we could possibly apply. Good. Have we got any more questions from Andrew and supported by Lyndon as well? Thank you very much for coming along. So I think it's been amazing. It's answered a lot of the questions that I had in my mind.